It was the spring of 1978. And Chicago was still shaking off its long winter the way a dog shakes off rain slowly. Reluctantly, as if warmth itself had to be earned. I was 51 years old, and I had been married to my husband for 26 years. 26 years of pressed shirts and Sunday roasts and the particular silence that settles into a house when two people have said everything they plan to say to each other and have quietly agreed to say nothing more. His name was Gerald Whitmore. He was the kind of man who filled a room simply by walking into it broad shoulders. Silver hair combed back with precision. A voice that carried without ever needing to be raised. He sold commercial real estate on the North Side, and he was very good at it. People trusted him. People always trusted Gerald. I was Dorothy Whitmore, née Callahan. I had been a bookkeeper before we married, good with numbers, better than most. But Gerald had asked me to stop working after our second year together. "You don't need to," he said. And back then, in 1952, that was something a woman was supposed to hear as a compliment. So, I stopped. I became the woman who maintained the house on Elmwood Avenue, who raised our daughter Caroline, who organized church fundraisers, and attended neighborhood association meetings, and made Gerald's world run smoothly and invisibly. The way good plumbing runs, you only notice it when something goes wrong. For 26 years, nothing went wrong. Or so I believed. It started on a Tuesday in April. Not a dramatic day in any outward sense. The forsythia along the front walk had just begun to bloom, that startling yellow that always arrived before you expected it, before you felt ready for color again. I remember thinking it was almost too cheerful, like something was trying too hard to convince me everything was fine. Gerald had left for a conference in Milwaukee. 3 days, he said. The Lakefront Commercial Properties Symposium. He had attended it every year since 1969. I drove him to O'Hare myself and kissed him goodbye at the departures curb, and he straightened his tie in the reflection of the terminal door before walking inside, and I watched him disappear into the crowd the way I always did, and I drove home. I was cleaning the bedroom that afternoon, genuinely cleaning it. Not just tidying, the kind of deep cleaning I could only do when Gerald was away because he disliked disruption to his things when I pulled his side of the closet open to vacuum the floor beneath his suits. That's when the box fell. It was a shoe box, plain brown cardboard, the kind that dress shoes come in. It had been sitting on the top shelf behind his winter coat, pushed far back against the wall. When I moved the coat to vacuum behind it, the box came with it and landed at my feet with a sound that was somehow too heavy, too solid for just a shoebox. I stood there for a long moment before I picked it up. I have thought many times since then about what I might have done differently. I could have put it back. I could have slid it onto the shelf and replaced the coat and vacuumed around it and gone downstairs to start dinner and never known. Some part of me understood, in that moment before I opened it, that what was inside would cost me something. That the life I knew, the safe, quiet, managed life on Elmwood Avenue, existed on one side of that cardboard lid, and that whatever was on the other side would not let me go back. I opened it. Inside was a bundle of letters, tied with kitchen twine. Beneath them, a photograph. And beneath the photograph, a savings account passbook from a bank I had never heard of, First Continental Savings, with a branch address in Evanston. I sat down on the edge of the bed. The photograph first, because I suppose I was still hoping for something innocent, something explainable. A photograph could be anything. Could be old business contacts, could be property listings, could be a dozen things. It was a woman. She was perhaps 40 years old, dark-haired, pretty in a careful, deliberate way. She was sitting in what looked like a restaurant booth. And she was smiling at whoever was behind the camera the way a woman smiles at someone she loves. Not performing, not posing. Just smiling because the person looking at her made her want to. Written on the back, in handwriting I did not recognize. Millie, October 1975. 3 years. At minimum, 3 years. I don't know how long I sat with the photograph before I reached for the letters. Long enough for the light in the room to change. For a shadow to move across the wall. When I finally untied the twine and opened the first envelope, my hands were steady. That steadiness surprised me then. It surprises me still, when I think back on it. I had always believed that if something like this happened, and some small, wary part of me had always known it could happen, I think all wives carry that knowledge somewhere they don't look directly at, I would fall apart. I would cry, or scream, or simply cease to function in some fundamental way. Instead, I became very calm and very precise, and I read every letter in that box from beginning to end. Her name was Mildred Crane. She went by Millie. She lived in Evanston, which explained the bank. She worked as a dental hygienist. She had a son named Kevin who was 9 years old. And from the letters, from the way Gerald wrote about Kevin, my boy, growing so fast, I'll take him to a Cubs game this summer, it was clear that Kevin was Gerald's son too. My husband had a son. A 9-year-old son I had never known about. In a house in Evanston, with a woman he had been keeping for at least a decade. I read it all. Every endearment, every promise, every practical arrangement. Gerald sent money to a post office box in Evanston. He visited on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons when he told me he had late client meetings. He had missed Caroline's high school graduation recital because of a so-called property closing. I remembered that afternoon. Remembered how Caroline had looked out at the audience and tried not to let her face show what she felt when the seat beside me stayed empty. And the passbook. The savings account held $47,000. Gerald had been moving money there steadily. Small amounts, irregular enough not to notice in our joint account but consistent over years. Long enough that it had accumulated to something significant. Something that suggested this was not an affair. This was a parallel life. Deliberately constructed, carefully funded. The last letter in the bundle was dated 6 months earlier, October 1977. In it, Gerald had written something that made me stop breathing. I've been thinking about the house. It makes more sense for you and Kevin to be on the deed. If anything ever happens with Dorothy, and honestly, Millie, I've been thinking it might be time to make some decisions. I want you both secure. I'm talking to Howard next week. Howard was Howard Bressler, Gerald's attorney, his friend of 30 years. I sat with that sentence for a long time. If anything ever happens with Dorothy, in the context of what I now knew, a secret family, hidden money, an attorney consultation, those words arranged themselves in my mind in a way I could not ignore. Gerald had always been a man who managed things, who made decisions and executed them without sentiment, who believed, I think genuinely, that he was the architect of every situation around him and that other people were variables to be arranged. He had arranged our marriage. He had arranged my retirement from work. He had arranged this other life alongside ours with the same methodical precision he applied to commercial leases. What did anything ever happens mean from a man like that? I put everything back in the box exactly as I had found it. I replaced it on the shelf behind the coat. I finished vacuuming the bedroom. Then I went downstairs, and I sat at the kitchen table, and I thought for 4 hours without moving. Here is what I understood by the end of those 4 hours. I had no income of my own. The checking account was in Gerald's name, with me as a joint holder, but Gerald could remove me. The house was titled to both of us, but I had no idea what our actual financial picture looked like beyond what Gerald chose to show me. I had not filed my own taxes since 1953. I did not know which bank held our mortgage, or whether it was paid off, or what insurance policies existed, or what Gerald was worth in any real sense. I had been the bookkeeper for my own household for 26 years, and I had been kept, deliberately and completely, in the dark about the actual books. I had one thing Gerald did not know I had. Numbers. I had always been good with numbers, and I had never entirely stopped thinking that way, even through 26 years of casseroles and fundraisers. And I had something else. I had 3 days while Gerald was in Milwaukee or wherever Gerald actually was to figure out exactly what I was dealing with. The next morning, I drove to the Cook County Recorder of Deeds office on Clark Street, and I looked up the title to our house. Both names. Good. I drove to our bank and asked a teller, very politely, for a full account statement for the past 24 months. The teller looked at me with the particular expression that bank employees reserved for women of my generation asking financial questions. A look that managed to be both condescending and pitying, and I looked back at her with the expression of a woman who had just decided she was done being managed, and she printed the statements. I took them to a diner on Michigan Avenue, and I read them over coffee. The pattern was there. Once I knew to look for it. Monthly transfers, varying amounts, always to an external account, thousands of dollars, over years, moving quietly out of our joint account and into somewhere else. The $47,000 passbook was not the whole picture. It was just what he had kept at that particular bank. On the second day, I did something that frightened me more than anything else I had done so far. I drove to Evanston. I had the address from one of the letters. A house on Greenleaf Street, a modest 2-story, with a good yard, the kind of neighborhood where children played outside after school. I sat in my car across the street for 20 minutes, telling myself I was not going to do what I was about to do. And then I got out of the car and walked to the door, and knocked. She answered in a nurse's uniform. She must have been on her way to work, or just back from it. When she saw me, her face went through several expressions very quickly. Surprise. Recognition, though we had never met. She clearly knew who I was. Fear. And then, unexpectedly, something that looked almost like relief. We stood in her doorway for a moment without speaking. "I know who you are," she finally said. "I know who you are too," I said, "and I think we need to talk." She let me in. Her name was Mildred, and she was 42 years old, and she had been involved with my husband since 1968, which meant 10 years. Which meant she had been 19 years old when it started, and Gerald had been 41. She had not known, at the beginning, that he was married. By the time she found out, she was pregnant with Kevin, and by then Gerald had made it very clear how things would be arranged. She would be provided for. She and the boy. But she would ask no questions and make no demands, and she would be available when he chose to visit and silent when he did not. She told me all of this in her kitchen over coffee, speaking quietly, the way a person speaks when they've been keeping a secret so long it has stopped feeling like a secret and started feeling like just the shape of their life. Kevin was in school. She had 40 minutes before she had to leave for her shift. "He told me last fall that he was planning to make changes," she said. "That's all he said. Changes." The way he said it. She stopped, set down her cup. The way he said it scared me. I didn't ask what kind of changes. I knew better than to ask. She said it so plainly, so without drama, that it took me a moment to understand what she was telling me. That she was scared of him too. That we were both, in different ways, afraid of the same man. "Did he ever?" I started. "Once," she said. 3 years ago. Kevin had done something at school, nothing serious, but Gerald was in a bad mood and she looked at her hands. I didn't report it. I knew what that would cost me. I thought of the letter. If anything ever happens with Dorothy. I thought of the attorney consultation. I thought of $47,000 in a savings account I had never known existed, and whatever else was in accounts I hadn't found yet. A man who hits the woman he keeps. A man quietly transferring marital assets for years. A man consulting his attorney about his wife's future while attending property conferences he may or may not actually be attending. I was not a dramatic person. I had never thought of myself as someone who existed inside a dramatic situation. But sitting in that kitchen in Evanston, I understood that I had been living inside one for a very long time, and the only difference now was that I knew it. "I need your help," I said. "And I think you need mine." She looked at me for a long moment. "Why would you help me?" "I'm the woman, your husband. You were 19, I said, "and you have a child. And he has apparently decided that things need to change for both of us." I looked at her steadily. "I was a bookkeeper before I was married. A good one, and I spent last night going through 2 years of our bank statements. There's more money than what's in that Evanston account. I don't know where it all is yet, but I intend to find out. And when I do, I intend to make sure that neither of us is left with nothing while he walks away with everything." She was quiet for a very long time. "What do you need from me?" she said. What I needed was specific. Every letter he had sent her, every financial record she had, any bank account information she was aware of, any property he had mentioned, anything with his name on it. She had more than I expected. She had kept everything, every envelope, every scrap, with the careful instinct of a woman who has always understood, even if she never said it. That evidence was the only security available to her. I spent the rest of that afternoon at the Chicago Public Library on Michigan Avenue, using the business reference section. I knew how to research property records. I had helped Gerald enough times, early in our marriage, before he made clear he did not need my help. I knew how title searches worked, how to find recorded deeds, how to trace holding companies. What I found, over 4 hours of careful searching, was that Gerald had purchased 2 properties in the past 8 years, a small commercial building in Wicker Park and a residential rental in Rogers Park, neither of which appeared in our joint financial picture. Both were held by an LLC called Whitmore Holdings, which I had never heard of. Whitmore Holdings. The name of my husband's secret company, built with money that belonged, legally, to both of us. When Gerald came home from Milwaukee on Thursday evening, I had dinner on the table. The house was clean, and I smiled when he kissed my cheek at the door. He told me the conference had gone well. I asked the right questions, in the right places, and I listened to his answers, and I smiled again, and I poured his coffee, and I said nothing. I had already called an attorney. Her name was Patricia Holloway. A friend from my church fundraising committee had mentioned her once, years ago, in the context of a neighbor's divorce, sharp as a tack, and she doesn't let them see it coming. I had filed that away without understanding why. Women of my generation filed a great many things away without understanding why. I think we knew, on some level, that the day might come. Patricia Holloway had an office on Wacker Drive, and when I sat across from her desk 2 days later and laid out what I had found, the letters, the bank passbook photographs I had taken with my daughter's Polaroid, the deed records, the LLC, she looked at all of it in silence for a long time. Then she looked at me. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said, "do you understand what you've found here?" "I believe I do," I said. "Illinois is not a community property state," she said. "But assets accumulated during the marriage are subject to equitable distribution. What your husband has done, the systematic transfer of marital funds into undisclosed accounts and holding companies, constitutes financial fraud in the context of divorce proceedings. This is not a small thing." "I know," I said. "I'll need everything you have, and I'll need your husband not to know what's coming until we're ready to file." "He doesn't know anything," I said. She nodded, and she looked at me the way people very rarely looked at me, with something close to admiration. Not despite my age, not despite my gender, but simply because of the task I had undertaken and the composure with which I was undertaking it. "How long have you known?" 8 days, I said. For 8 days I had continued to cook his breakfast and iron his shirts and sit across the dinner table and speak to him about the ordinary mechanics of ordinary life, and I had been simultaneously dismantling the architecture of everything he had built on my silence. 8 days of being, in every visible way, exactly the woman he believed me to be. It was the most difficult acting I have ever done. And also, in some way I have never fully been able to articulate, the most clarifying. Patricia filed in May. Gerald was served at his office on a Wednesday morning, and his secretary called me 30 minutes later, not to warn me, as I initially thought, but because she wanted me to know she was sorry, and because she had suspected for years and had never said anything, and the guilt of that had apparently become more than she could continue to carry quietly. What followed was not simple. I want to be honest about that. The months after Gerald was served were some of the hardest of my life, harder in some ways than the discovery itself. Gerald was not a man who accepted being outmaneuvered. He was angry in ways I had never seen, cold, precise anger. the kind that operates through lawyers and paperwork rather than raised voices, but anger nonetheless. He disputed everything. He moved to protect assets. He tried several approaches that Patricia anticipated and blocked. But I had the letters. I had the deed records. I had the LLC documents. I had the account statements. And I had, importantly, Millie Crane's testimony, which she provided willingly and at some personal cost to herself, because she had decided, as she told me, sitting in Patricia's office in a skirt, she had clearly pressed with care that she was done being a secret, and her son was done being one too. Caroline came home from Indianapolis when I told her. She sat with me at the kitchen table, and I told her everything, and she held my hand, and we didn't speak for a while. She had known something was wrong for years, she said. She had felt it the way children feel things, not in specific facts, but in the texture of the air in a house, in the patterns that never quite added up. She was 30 years old. She was strong in a way that made me understand I had done at least one thing right. "What are you going to do?" she said. After. I had been thinking about that. About what after looked like. I was 51 years old. I had not worked in 26 years. I had no recent employment history, no professional references, no portfolio of recent work that a prospective employer could evaluate. What I did have was 26 years of managing a household budget, organizing large-scale fundraising events, handling scheduling and correspondence and logistics for a man whose career had depended on exactly those things being done invisibly and well. I had, in 8 days of research, navigated property records and bank documentation and corporate filings with more competence than Gerald had apparently anticipated. "I'm going to find work," I said. "Something with numbers." She smiled. "You should," she said. "You're better at it than you think." The divorce was finalized 14 months later. The settlement was not everything I had asked for, but it was substantially more than Gerald believed I would receive. The house on Elmwood Avenue was sold, and my portion of the equity was significant. Whitmore Holdings was required to account for assets accumulated during the marriage. The $47,000 in Evanston was not the total. As I had suspected, the total, by the time Patricia's forensic accountant had finished, was considerably more. I found a position with a small accounting firm in Lincoln Park. They were hiring someone to manage client accounts and billing, a role that required exactly the skills I had maintained in cold storage for 26 years. The interview lasted 45 minutes, and the principal, a woman named Margaret Osei, who had built the firm from scratch over 15 years, offered me the position before I left her office. "You have a gap," she said, looking at my resume. 26 years, I said. "What did you do in those 26 years?" "I managed a household budget, coordinated large fundraising events, handled all scheduling and financial correspondence for a man whose business depended on it, and recently spent 8 days conducting a forensic review of my husband's hidden assets before retaining an attorney and navigating a 14-month divorce proceeding." I paused. Numbers don't scare me. People who rely on others not understanding numbers scare me considerably less than they used to. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Can you start Monday? I want to tell you about Kevin. Because Kevin is the part of this story that people sometimes expect to be straightforward, the part they expect me to be bitter about, and I have never been able to be what they expect there." Kevin Crane was 9 years old when this began, and he had done nothing wrong. He had a father who had constructed his entire life around the convenience of his father's choices and the secrecy of them, and when that secrecy ended, Kevin was the one who lost the most stable presence in his daily life. Imperfect and dishonest as that presence had been, Millie was a good mother. She was also, for the first time in 10 years, fully alone in supporting her son. Because Gerald's financial arrangements with her ceased the moment papers were filed. I was not responsible for that, Gerald was. But I knew what it was to have a child, and I knew what a 9-year-old boy deserved, and what he deserved was not to be collateral damage in his father's reckoning. Millie and I were never friends in any conventional sense. What we were was something harder to name two women who had been made, without our knowledge or consent, into participants in the same deception, and who had chosen, rather than direct the damage of that deception at each other, to turn and face it together. She attended the same attorney consultations when her own interests were involved. We exchanged information. We were honest with each other in a way that was sometimes uncomfortable and always necessary. She moved to Milwaukee eventually, closer to her sister. Kevin went with her. He is, as far as I know, a grown man now. I hope he had the life he deserved. Gerald remarried. Briefly, I heard, through people we had known in common, that the second marriage lasted 3 years. I heard this without particular satisfaction and without particular sorrow. Gerald was not my problem anymore, and had not been for a long time. There is a thing that happens when you have spent your adult life being managed, when every decision about money and work and what your capabilities are has been filtered through someone else's assessment of you, that is very difficult to name from the inside. From the inside, it doesn't feel like being managed. It feels like being provided for. It feels like security. The management is so complete, so invisible, that you cannot see its shape until you are standing outside it, blinking in the unfamiliar light of your own autonomy, discovering with some astonishment that you have been capable all along of doing the things you were told you did not need to do. I worked for Margaret O'Sea's firm for 11 years before I retired. I handled client accounts with the precision and the thoroughness that 26 years of enforced domesticity had not diminished in the slightest. And I was good at it. And I knew I was good at it, which was different and more important. I bought my own apartment in Lincoln Park, on the 3rd floor of a building with a bay window that looked out onto the street. I decorated it exactly as I chose. I cooked what I wanted to eat and left dishes in the sink when I was tired, and slept in the middle of the bed. Caroline lives in Indianapolis with her family. She has 2 daughters. I visit as often as I can, and when I sit at her kitchen table and watch her daughters move through their lives working, making decisions, holding their own money in their own accounts, with the comfortable unself-consciousness of a generation that has never been told they don't need to, I feel something that is too large for a word as small as proud, something closer to vindication, not for myself, though perhaps a little for myself, but mostly for every woman who was told that being provided for was the same as being free, and who accepted that trade in good faith, and who discovered too late, or just in time, or sometimes not at all, that it was not the same thing. It was a shoebox on a closet shelf, a plain brown shoebox, pushed far back behind a winter coat, on a Tuesday in April, when the forsythia was blooming yellow along my front walk. I have thought about that forsythia many times since, how it came up every spring without asking permission, without apology for its color, without concern for whether the timing suited anyone, just blooming because that was what it did, because that was what it had always been capable of doing, whether anyone was looking or not. I was 51 years old the spring I found that box. I am older now, and I am wiser in the specific way that comes not from books or from other people's lessons, but from having lived through the particular thing that was yours to live through, and having come out on the other side still standing. I have never remarried. That was my choice, made freely, which is the only way a choice means anything at all. What I want to leave with you, if you take nothing else from this story, is this: know where your money is. Know whose name is on the accounts, on the deeds, on the policies. Not because you suspect something is wrong, but because that knowledge is not a betrayal of love, it is a condition of your own dignity. It is the difference between being a partner in your own life and being a guest in someone else's management of it. And if you are the age I was that spring, if you are sitting somewhere right now telling yourself, it is too late to know, too late to learn, too late to stand in the uncomfortable light of your own capabilities, I am here to tell you, with the full authority of a woman who found out at 51 that she was more than she had been permitted to be. It is not too late. It was never too late. It was only ever waiting.